Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anita Bhela from the University of Delhi. Today we will be doing the module Mythic Archetypal Criticism and Introduction. This module has been prepared by Dr. Belur Rahman from the Central University of Rajasthan, Kishangarh. Today we are going to study about myths and about archetypes. When certain symbols reoccur, certain motifs, certain themes, certain ideas, they continuously reoccur not only in one particular nation but in the stories of many nations and many communities, and they seem to acquire a pattern, then we refer to them as archetypes. Thus, archetypes are universal motifs, patterns, and codes. They involve the symbols of light and darkness, colors, symbols of nature, the cycle of the seasons, and so on. Everybody is familiar with the idea of myth. Myths are stories that have come down to us from generations and which have become a part of our consciousness, such that we always refer to them as symbols, even the characters and sometimes even the situations. If we take the example of the Ramayana, then Ravan is the eternal symbol of evil and Ram is the eternal symbol of good. Similarly, the story of the Mahabharata, Duryodhan stands for greed, Shakuni for cunningness and trickery, and the Pandavas for good. And many, if you read the present day literature as well, you will see that the Mahabharata myth manifests itself in different ways in different works of literature. All writers seem to go back to many of these myths, whether to adapt them, whether to refute them, or whether to re-represent them. Thus, we form the idea of myth. But there are other people who deal with myths of different religions, different communities, and different nations, and try to discover a pattern in them. Carl Jung, what does he have to say about myths? He defines myths and he says myths are first and foremost psychic phenomenon that reveal the nature of the soul. The idea of the archetype is linked with Jung's concept of the collective unconsciousness. The collective unconscious, in which dwell archaic, or I would say primordial types, to say it in his words, that is, with universal images that have existed since the remotest times. Thus, there is the recurring primordial image of the human being in the myth, and myth illustrates those primordial images. In fact, the primordial images manifest the instinct of human nature. What are the assumptions of archetypal criticism? There are certain basic assumptions on which it is formulated. The archetypal critic observes criticism conceptually as a science. Archetypal criticism studies structures, sets, and apparatuses of myths and archetypes in literature. Myth is not pure because it is a residual in breached condition refracted through imageries and symbols, the medium of representing the archetypes. Literature in itself is a self-contained universe. Archetypal criticism depends on thinking about literature as a multidisciplinary genre. Mythical archetypal literary criticism insists that the reader understand the symbols and imageries which exposit the characteristics of instincts of human beings. That is, you have to go deep into it and see what are the symbols and motives that seem to be representing the human instincts. The first progenitor of archetypal criticism was James G. Frazer's The Golden Bough, followed by the theorist in psychology Carl Jung. And he applied the term archetype for primordial images, the psychic residue, collective unconscious. The spokesperson for that were Joseph Campbell and Maud Bodkin, and the theorist in literature, that is Northrop Frye. What are Jung's archetypes? Some of the chief archetypes with which Jung is concerned are, you must have seen that in many stories the shadow is very important. Then you always seem to have in the stories or myths the wise old man, or you have the innocent child or the child hero sometimes. The mother figure is extremely important in myths. You also have the innocent maiden. You have the anima in man, that is the feminine element in man, and you have the animus in woman, that is the masculine element in woman. You also have the figure of the trickster, and of course, the most important of all, you have the hero. Maud Bodkin's book, Patterns in Poetry. She was one of the first scholars to apply Jung's ideas to literature. She rejects the notion that archetypes are stamped upon the physical organism or inherited in the structure of the brain. But the persistent cultural symbols that are passed down through generations via folklore, myth, and literature. That is, Jung said that they were part of the unconscious, and she says that they are part of what has been passed down to us for generations in myths and stories. She has used the term archetypal pattern to refer to something that lives within us, which is source and the medium of the effective presentation of an ancient theme. Joseph Campbell talks about the universal myth of motherhood, and he refers to Mother Virgin Mary. And I'm quoting him, "The story is recounted everywhere, and with such striking uniformity of the main contours that the early Christian missionaries were forced to think that the devil himself must be throwing up the mockeries of their teaching wherever they set their hand." That is, this story of the myth of universal motherhood is found in almost all cultures, and therefore they were surprised. In literature, archetypes occur as heroes. The hero can be either male or female, but in Western literature, it is more often a male. He has some characteristics apart from those of the common people. He is superior to them morally, mentally, and physically. There is always another character, that is the villain. He counterbalances the hero. He usually embodies the evil the hero must battle in his search for self and the conquest of evil. And the villain is always thwarting the actions of the hero. Then you have, in many myths, you have the fair maiden. The fair maiden is often the romantic focus of the hero or the villain. She's the victim who has to be saved from evil, and she's extremely pure and innocent of the world's ways. We have many characters who represent that in literature. The hero generally has a mentor, and this mentor prepares him for his journey. He's the one who prepares the hero for the journey and the ultimate battle. He's the person who provides the lessons the hero uses during the quest and ultimate battle. He's given lessons for improving his moral strength, and many a time he gives up his life or makes a sacrifice to save another or to save a cause. He is known as the shaman or wise man, and examples are Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings or Obi-Wan Kenobi from the Star Wars. There is always another character too, that is the sidekick or the evil henchman. He seems to reinforce the personality of the hero, often adds humor or warm fuzzes. He supports or is the best friend of the hero or villain. The examples are Batman and Robin, Lone Ranger, and Tonto. In these myths, a lot of significance is given to colors. The red comes from blood. It symbolizes passion, passion of love, and also the passion of anger. It also symbolizes courage and violence. Many times it is associated with sin as well, as in the Scarlet Woman. It is associated with Valentine's Day, with certain particular themes, certain settings, life cycles. Black. Of course, we are very familiar with black and white. Black symbolizes darkness, the night, fear, sin, death. And sometimes, though rarely, it is sometimes positive of elegance, sleekness, and simplicity. As a negative, we have a brilliant example in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Shakespeare's Macbeth uses the images of darkness to reflect the darkness of the deeds and the darkness of the night in which these evil deeds are performed. White, of course, recalls to us the clouds, the white snow, something which is pristine, which is something which is pure, which symbolizes innocence and purity. And many a times we say that someone has fainted, and so he appears to be white. So it's sometimes negative, as it sometimes also refers to sterility or pallor or blankness. The color blue, sometimes it seems to fascinate us. The blue sky, the still waters, and we get a feeling of peace and tranquility. But of course, bruises are blue. If a person lacks oxygen, he turns blue. And sometimes you are blue when you are dead. So these are the negative associations with the color blue. Gold or yellow, symbol of energy, symbol of the sun, symbol of something eternal, everlasting, symbol of the bright fields of yellow flowers, symbol of the gods and of royalty, and symbol of fullness, ripeness, and harvest. Of course, it has some negative connotations as well. Sometimes it becomes, it's used when people are deceitful. It also sometimes refers to cowardice, treason, jaundice, and sickness. The purple color. The purple color symbolizes royalty. It was a very difficult dye, very hard to process, and therefore only the wealthy could possess it. It also symbolizes wisdom and valor. Of course, there are some negative associations as well when you have bruises and when something is rotten. Another very common symbol is the circle. What does the circle symbol symbolize? It symbolizes something which is continuous and which, if it begins at one end, ends at the same and then continues again. So it reminds us of many things in life. A group of people huddled around the fire. The embrace, that is when family members meet and hug each other. And a symbol also of eternity because it has neither beginning nor end. The wedding ring is a symbol of unity and eternity, and it is because it is circular in shape. Assumptions of archetypal criticism. The critics observe archetypal criticism as a structuralist approach to literature because it advocates myths as signifiers of recurring imageries in literature. Northrop Frye's semiotic standpoints for literary arts depend on his assumptions of the 5 phases of symbolism, ideas of imageries, myths, and their temporal source to what he called monad. Monad is, says Northrop Frye, a symbol in its aspect as a center of one's total literary experience, related to Hopkins' term "inscape" and to Joyce's term "epiphany." But while reading his works, we can observe archetypal criticism as an eclectic approach to literature. It reflects glimpses of many established approaches to literature. For example, like formalism, archetypal criticism focuses on the important devices like new criticism. It lays emphasis on close reading, that is, explication, like structuralism. It instructs the reader to become conscious of minimal sets and apparatuses of language, like my theme used in literature, and like post-structuralism. It expresses inability to define the center of recurring images and undecidable root and roots. Archetypal criticism consists in the art of close reading. It explicates the text in relation to mythos, generally we call narrative. For Frye, each literary narrative is an order of words, plot, argument, embedded in literary pieces with unique artistry. Thus, it has 2 basic arms, as Frye states. Criticism will always have 2 aspects, one turned towards the structure of literature and one turned towards the other cultural phenomena that form the social environment of literature. However, both structure of literature and social environment of literature are made of a centripetal structure of meaning in the guise of myth. As he says, a myth being a centripetal structure of meaning, it can be made to mean an indefinite number of things, and it is more fruitful to study what in fact myths have been made to mean. These myths directly or indirectly recur in literature. They represent human psyche, its struggle, and effects of the struggle in the 3rd chapter, That is what he refers to in the third chapter of Anatomy of Criticism. Northrop Frye develops the theory of archetypes in literature and discusses the imageries that represent birth, death, and struggle in human life. Moreover, he exhibits three major imageries representing major myths in his book Anatomy of Criticism. Frye exemplifies these myths, encapsulating them in three types of imageries: apocalyptic imageries, demonic imageries, and analogical imageries. Apocalyptic imageries are the city, garden, sheepfold, and lamb. There are literatures which mostly carry out these imageries to produce impact of divinity in the audience's mind. We find many examples in literature of analogical imageries. Browning's Childe Roland and Eliot's Wasteland have much of such imagery. Analogical imageries of relationship of man with God under some patron figure like wise old men with magical powers like Prospero, or friendly guardian spirits like Raphael before Adam's fall. Milton's Paradise Lost and Marlowe's Dr. Faustus also have many such imageries, which are examples of analogical imageries, which represents the adaptation of myth to nature. They give us not the city and the garden at the final goal of human vision, but the process of building and planting. Reading of these imageries unites the mystery of the process of life, that is, the fundamental form of process is cyclical movement. The alteration of success and decline, effort and repose, life and death, which is the rhythm of process. The high mimetic imageries stand for chastity, magic, love, form, nature, and reason. The low mimetic imageries stand for the analogy of experience and which bears a relation to the demonic. Frye traces high mimetic imageries in great literature of all times. Chastity, innocent characters, purity symbols like women, Dante's with Leda and Shakespeare's Miranda. Fire in the innocent world is usually a purifying symbol. The pastoral sheep and lambs, unicorn, the traditional emblem of chastity, the dramatic festival of the ass, no less than that of the boy bishop, belong to the structure of imagery. And when Shakespeare put an ass's head in fairyland, he was not doing something unique. Birds, butterflies, the animals are those of proud beauty. The eagle and the lion stand for the vision of the royal, by the loyal, the horse and the falcon for chivalry, or the aristocracy on horseback. The peacock and the swan are the birds of Cenossa, and the phoenix or unique firebird is a favorite poetic emblem, especially in England for Queen Elizabeth. Just as the organizing ideas of romance are chastity and magic, so the organizing ideas of the high mimetic are seen to be love and form. And as the field of romantic images may be called an analogy of innocence, so the field of high mimetic imagery may be called an analogy of nature and reason. Thus, we can say that archetypal criticism is a scientific investigation. In this connection, Frye writes, just as there is an order of nature behind the natural sciences, so literature is not just a piled aggregate of works, but an order of words. Thus, literature is not an aggregate but an order of words. I say again. In the second chapter of Anatomy of Criticism, he characterizes the order of words as a literary monad. Fry illustrates the theory of mythos as imageries to what he termed romance, high mimetic and low mimetic. These three intermediate structures of imagery are constellations of images. When they are traced in organized form, they make what Fry called atmosphere. The mode of romance presents an idealized world. In romance, heroes are brave, heroines beautiful, villains villainous, and the frustrations, ambiguities, and embarrassments of ordinary life are made little of. Its imagery presents a human counterpart of the apocalyptic world, which we may call the analogy of innocence. Romance for Fry is not concerned with a particular period, as we call the medieval romances or other romances, but has concern with the process he calls romanticizings. And he says, romance is best known to us, not from the age of romance itself, but from later romanticizings. And he gives the example of Comus, The Tempest, and the third book of the Fairy Queen in the Renaissance. And then Blake's Songs of Innocence and Keats' Endymion are some of the examples that he cites. He thinks that the Spenser's Fairy Queen is the best example of the quest theme. What does atmosphere reflect? Atmosphere reflects the 7 categories of images as different forms of the rotary or the cyclical movement. The continuum of identity in the individual life from birth to death is extended from death to rebirth. The doctrine of reincarnation, newborn light threatened by the powers of darkness. Duality between experience and innocence, human and animal imageries, harvest and vintage vegetable imageries, nostalgia, regret, exaltation imageries, and the water symbolism and the coming back symbols. Fry traces the cyclical symbol of the 7 images to 3 major myths that have been discussed. That is the apocalyptic, demonic, and analogical. These cyclic symbols are usually divided into 4 main phases. That is the 4 seasons of the year, and being the type for the 4 phases, seasons, periods are metaphorical signs of stages of culture, which reflect human civilization and forms of human universe. Archetypal criticism attempts to posit the view that literature is a self-contained universe. Keeping this notion in mind, Fry has conceptualized a larger whole of archetype. He has called the symbol as monad, or the totality of the order of words. However, monad is an imaginative and hypothetical fiction. It is dialectic in nature, its phase is yet to come. The totality of monad is inclusive, whereas myth is in a hypothetical form. The basic contention of archetypal criticism rests on thinking about literature as a multidisciplinary genre, as we said earlier. An archetypal critic thinks that psychology, anthropology, theology, history, law, and everything else, built out of words, have been informed or constructed by the same kind of myths and metaphors that we find in their original hypothetical form in literature. The universe of myth, that is literature, is a reflex of truth ingrained in the history of human condition and retains the same as timeless imageries. Northrop Frye himself taught literature as if it was theology or as if it was a subject of Christian mythology. He studied history, art, mythology, theology, culture, society, and civilization, as if they were representations of the same phenomenon in many other forms, that is, an archetypal representation of human subjects. He also talked as mythos, as imageries of what he termed romance, high mimetic and low mimetic. His ideas and ideas of archetypal criticism were furthered in Roland Barthes' Mythologies, written in 1957, in which he talks of codes of literature reflecting secret cultural meanings of life. The other practitioners of archetypal criticism are Richard Chase, Leslie Fielder, Daniel Hoffman, and Philip Wheelwright. Today, you have had an introduction to mythic archetypal criticism, and you have studied that the archetypal critic tries to find some universal patterns in myths and legends that are prevalent all over the world. It's a vast subject, but we have come to know some of its basic tenets. We know that a mythic archetypal critic tries to look for universal patterns in myths and legends and stories and other things. He looks for patterns of sound, looks for patterns of color, of characters, symbols of nature. He looks for universality in these things. He finds that certain things remain common to all cultures. Maybe they are part of the ingrained consciousness, or maybe they are acquired, and yet they are common, especially the quest symbol, the hero, the villain, the trickster, the fair and innocent maiden. All these we have come to know about. When you read other works of literature, you too may try to find these patterns in those texts. And I'm sure you will be rewarded, because these patterns, if we go beyond the surface, are very much universal in nature. And irrespective of the time when a work was written, you will find them in literature of all periods. For more information, refer to the e-text. Thank you.